Well, while people are getting seated, let me go ahead and welcome you to our fall Lou Douglas Lecture. I'm Linda Tiener, the Executive Director at UFM Community Learning Center. UFM is the sponsor of this lecture series. I'd like to remind everybody that this week UFM is celebrating its 40th anniversary on campus, and we'd invite you to join us Thursday over the noon hour in the courtyard outside here. The first 150 people get an anniversary cupcake. There'll be entertainment and some other activities. So please come and join us on Thursday. And I'd also like to let you know that on Tuesday and Wednesday, November 18th and 19th, UFM, Crossroads at ECM, and a number of other K-State organizations are sponsoring a fair trade marketplace, which will also be right outside here in the courtyard from 10 to 6 on Tuesday and Wednesday, the 18th and 19th of November. We're also still looking for volunteers to help with that, so if you want to go to our website, on our homepage there's a place where you can click on Fair Trade Marketplace. That will give you information about the marketplace and take you to the website where you can sign up to volunteer. Now that everyone is settled, the Lou Douglas Lecture Series is named for Lou Douglas, who was an esteemed professor of political science at Kansas State University from 1949 until 1977. Lou was also an influential member of the UFM Board of Directors until his death in 1979. With principle, humor, and wisdom, Lou motivated grassroots organizations and individuals to pursue social justice in politics, economics, and foreign policy. His concern was always for the disenfranchised, the excluded, and the poor. Civil rights was a great interest of his, and he did much to further that cause in the United States. He represented the highest standards of public morality and elicited our best impulses as citizens. And so it's in that spirit that the Lou Douglas Lecture Series brings provocative speakers with stimulating discussion that promotes original thinking and question of traditional values. I think tonight's lecture will do that quite well. Our speaker tonight is Paula Allen. She's an internationally known activist photojournalist. Living in Manhattan, Kansas, we seem to often be insulated from the poverty, violence, and oppression felt by people around the world. I think that's going to be brought much closer to home to you all tonight in what Paula has to talk about. Paula has concentrated on photographing women around the world in their courageous and often invisible confrontation with violence and oppression. Women standing up for justice and standing up for their own rights and asking for apology, asking for reparation, asking to be justice done on their behalf. Paula's going to talk about some of the situations that she has found herself in. And unlike a standard photojournalist that goes in, takes a few pictures, and is gone, Paula acts almost like an anthropologist in the way she approaches things. She gets to know her subjects and goes back and photographs them over a time period. She's been in Chile. She's been in the Democratic Republic of Congo. She's been in Chechnya. She's worked in Asia. She's been in New Orleans since Katrina. And she has many stories to tell us. And I don't want to bore you with more biography about her. I'd like you to meet her. She's a terrific person, excited and dynamic. She's going to give us a photo essay of her pictures and talk about them. When she's finished, those of you who have to go, please leave so quietly, and we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. She has a lot to say, and please join me in welcoming Paula Allen.
Let me just do a mic check. Are we all okay? All over? I am literally chomping at the bit to get up here and be with you all tonight and bring the world to Manhattan, Kansas. I feel like I've just arrived into the heart of America here. It's extraordinary, and what a critical night before the most critical night to be here. So that even makes me doubly honored to be with all of you. And the reason I'm here is because I was brought by the UFM Community Learning Center, the Lou Douglas Advisory Board, and the Student Governing Association. And thank you all for understanding a particular kind of an urgency in the world right now. That we are all, from here to Afghanistan to Democratic Republic of Congo, we are all so deeply connected as a planet right now, and we really have to live our lives with that knowledge. And it doesn't matter where you are in the world. I became a photographer 30 years ago, and it wasn't expected in a way, but it happened. And I realized that I became a photographer because I'm so challenged as a human being on some level, and what an incredible time it is to be human. And I really needed a means, and I was 20 years old, of understanding how to hold all of the massive contradictions on this planet, which means holding the love we feel, and the pleasure and the joy, and also the pain and despair and agony of the world. And one of the things in 30 years of working all over the world is that I have really found out that the strongest way, the greatest possibility of hope, of holding the hope, has always been for me in the stories of women. And they're primarily invisible stories all over the world. So I'm going to keep chomping at the bit here, and I'm going to leap into the photographs. And we're going to meet women in Chile, and we're going to meet women in Asia, in Korea and the Philippines, and then to the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I have literally just returned from both the Democratic Republic of Congo and Chile last week. And these are the stories. Why they're the stories of hope is because women are refusing to be silenced. They're really refusing to not speak the truth, to not seek the truth. They're breaking silence in the face of enormous adversity and potentially grave consequences. And they're also demanding accountability of governments. They're demanding that the perpetrators of crimes be held accountable for their criminal acts. They're asking for reparations, and they're asking for apologies from governments. And we really need to see this happen. So in the spirit of the love of the women all over the world, and the honor of bringing them to you, let's hit the lights. On Christmas Day, 1989, I walked into the Atacama Desert in northern Chile for the first time with the women of Calama. 6 of us moved slowly across the barren expanse with shovels and plastic bags. A week before, I had been in my home in New York City preparing for an assignment in Santiago, without ever knowing there was a place in the world called Calama. A friend had called and said, "I have just seen a film about women in Chile called Dance of Hope by filmmaker Deborah Schaefer, and I think you should see it." I did, and I was strongly moved by one story in particular. In this far northern desert town, a group of women whose fathers, husbands, brothers, and sons had been disappeared in 1973 into an unknown desert grave had been searching for years for their remains. Every year on October 19th, the anniversary of their loved ones' disappearances, the women threw flowers into the air, blanketing the sand with hundreds of red carnations. As a photographer committed to documenting the hidden struggles of women all over the world, I knew I had to be there. I flew to Santiago and then boarded the 26-hour bus ride to Calama and began a journey which has lasted now for 19 years. As I sat in the desert listening to the women's stories, spoken with such urgency, sorrow, and dignity, and love, I confirmed a commitment that somehow I had already made a week earlier in New York City to share their stories with the world. This is what happened in Chile. 1 month after the coup, on September 11, 1973, which overthrew the democratically elected Marxist government of Salvador Allende, A group of 5 soldiers set out to the north of Chile in a military helicopter. The mission was under the direct orders of Augusto Pinochet, who orchestrated the coup with the backing of the United States government. The mission came to be called the Caravan of Death. On October 19, 1973, the caravan made its final stop in Calama, where 26 men suspected of committing subversive activities were presumably executed and buried in a secret desert grave. During the first years after the disappearances, many of the wives, mothers, sisters of the men met secretly. Frustrated by official unwillingness to provide the truth about their relatives' fate, the women set out into the desert with their shovels to find the graves of their loved ones. This is their story. This is the town of Calama. Senora Leonilda, her son Manuel was executed and disappeared. Brunilda, her husband Bernardino was executed and disappeared. Vicky, her brother Jose was executed and disappeared. Hilda and her son Rolando, Hilda's husband, Rolando's father Jorge was executed and disappeared. Ruth and Monica, Ruth's husband, Monica's father, Milton, was executed and disappeared. Juana's husband, Manuel, who's Senor Leonilda's son, was executed and disappeared. Jali, whose father, Bernardino, was executed and disappeared. The women searching in the desert. When I arrived, they had been searching in the desert for 16 years. Vicky and Violetta, with holes that they dug, searching for the grave. This is Violetta speaking. We formed a kind of an information chain together. One friend contacted a friend, who then contacted another friend who was in the military. We went to the place he told us about. He assured us it was where the men were buried. The impression was that we were finally going to a place that was certain. There was fear and anguish, fear of seeing how they had been killed. They told us they had not just been shot by a firing squad, but it was a massacre. We went 50 kilometers out of Calama. There was nothing, another deception, another disillusionment. Violetta searching in a cave. Searching party to the Valley of the Moon. The Atacama Desert, where Calama is located, is the driest place on the planet. Victoria, this is her speaking. Every time we go out digging, we go psychologically prepared to find something. Once we went to look in a cave. I took gloves and plastic bags, whatever I thought we might need. We found rocks that were larger than a house, and of course, we could not move even one. Such a feeling of defeat, another attempt, and nothing. But I still think this could be the right place. Maybe in that pile of rocks there is a symbol, a sign. If there are rocks with blood stains, a button, a scrap of paper, if the dirt is darker, anything. There is always a feeling that one must search for something. the women formed a group, the Agrupación, and which was very brave because they formed it during the years that Augusto Pinochet was a dictator and still in power. And the sign says, it wasn't a war, it was a massacre. In 1990, Pinochet was finally voted out of power, and that was a total surprise to him. And the new president, whose name was Alwin, came into power as a democratic president, and the women held publicly their first demonstration, and they took over the Coliseum in Calama, and they placed 26 candles in front of 26 empty chairs to mark the absence of their men. Mass for the men, Grimilda and her daughter-in-law Maria. Grimilda's son was disappeared. Members of the Agrupación, Fidelisa and her granddaughter Lorena. After 17 years of searching, the women found a mass grave. And this is a sign that the women posted that says, the grave of the men who were executed by a firing squad, and the date by the caravan of death, and the name of the man, Sergio Ariano Stark, who headed the caravan. And these are quotes by 3 of the women. Violetta. On July 1990, we learned of the location of the mass grave. We had been only 2 kilometers away from this site a few months before. I was very affected when I arrived there. I felt rage and impotence that during 17 years of searching, I hadn't found it before. Vicky. The grave was only 15 kilometers from Calama, off the road to San Pedro. We were amazed that they would bury them only 500 meters from the road. Violetta and I arrived to the site before they closed it off, and lying on top of the earth were pieces of skulls, pieces of ribs and jaws. Some parts of the ground were soft, and as you stepped down on them, little bones would pop out of the sand. Senora Leonilda. When I arrived to the site, Violetta told me it was already closed off. I felt a tremendous nervous tension. I wanted to be in total silence. There was a lot of suffering from having to watch it from so far away. I had hoped that we would find whole bodies. I felt a kind of happiness that I was finally going to see my son complete. This is the first anniversary where the women had located the mass grave and had a grave site to march to after 17 years. The cross that they put in the mass grave site with the names of the men on each stone. Evidence reports they did only find fragments, parts of bodies, very small parts of bodies at the mass grave. And the women were given reports to try and identify which jaw or which toe or which bone belonged to their loved ones. In 1993, the women put the unidentifiable remains into a coffin to bury in a mausoleum. The woman in the center, her name is Maria Araya, and her husband, Ricardo, had been executed also at the same time the 26 men of Calama had been disappeared, but his body was returned to her but she had never opened the coffin, and she never really believed that Ricardo had been returned to her. So on that day in '93, we accompanied her and opened the coffin, and she identified her husband. In 1991, a year after the mass grave was found, a body of an executed man was found in a mine shaft by miners. And because the body was so intact, the authorities assumed that the body had been somebody who had committed suicide within the past year. And the women heard of the body, and they snuck into the morgue, and they identified the body as one that had been executed in 1973, and this is Luis Contreras Leon. And we buried his body in 1993 when the fragments were buried in the cemetery of Calama. These are the fragments from the mass grave site that were buried. In 1995, 5 years after finding the mass grave, 13 bodies out of the 26 were identified. And this is Maria Sepulveda and a picture of her husband. And she says, "It was a moment of joy having found him, and also deep sadness and pain after having a whole person who was beautiful, full of life, than to only find a few bones. You are left with a terrible doubt about whether that bone is really your partner. You can't believe it because the person you love, the father of your children, becomes a bone that you examine from every angle. I wanted to have him in my arms and hold him tight." Vicky's brother Jose was identified. This is Vicky. They were able to identify Jose by his jaw, a piece of his left cheek, which had a bullet hole through the height of his ear, a piece of his forehead with an exit wound from a bullet, part of his foot that was inside a work boot, and his nose. When I saw these parts, I could not accept it. I imagined his childish face and wide smile. I needed to hold these pieces and caress them because it was the last time I was going to have a part of him. I had waited 22 years to be with my brother. These are pictures from the 30th anniversary. Thirteen of the men were identified, 13 were not, so the women at 30 years were continuing to search for possibility of another mass grave. And I returned to Calama last week. I'd been into Chile, but not to Calama in 5 years. And so I returned for the 35th anniversary. And the women in January of this year had been given a lot of new information about what had happened to their men. And the probability is that the men were transported from the mass grave, and they were crushed in the process of transporting them, and they were put on a military plane, and their bodies were dumped into the sea. So I returned to Calama, and I went to the north, and I went to the sea, to the place where they presumably were thrown into. And I don't know whether it's true or not, but I realize that the story of Calama and the 35 years and the 17 years of searching and the years of seeking justice, and it could really end in a watery grave. These are Senor Leonilda now, who's partially paralyzed, Juana, her daughter-in-law, and her great-great-granddaughter. One note on the color images is that because I just came back, I knew I was going to see you all tonight, so I decided to make some digital pictures so I could be able to show you the new images because the black and white hasn't been processed yet. This is Ruth and her daughter Monica, if you remember the picture, and this is Monica's daughter, who is the same age that Monica was when her father was disappeared. Now there is an incredibly beautiful monument at the gravesite with 26 columns for each of the men. Violetta preparing for the 35th anniversary. There was a photograph that was found a couple of years ago of the men before they were executed. And this is the final picture of this series. I published a book called Flores en el Desierto, Flowers in the Desert, in 1999, and I am going to reissue the book with a new chapter after 35 years. In the book that I published, the incredibly beautiful writer Isabel Allende wrote an essay, and I'd like to end this with a quote by her that was in the book. "The women of Calama are the poor of unredeemed poverty, the patient of absolute patience. They are strong and they are alone. For years, no one has listened to their cries. For years, justice ignored their anguish. Their skin has been weathered by leaden sun. Their eyes faded from searching so long through sand and stones. Their hearts forever melted into tears. Nothing can conquer them, not time, the world's indifference, nor their hope shattered 1,000 times and 1,000 times patched together again. More powerful than the fear clutching their souls and the fatigue invading their bones was a determination to find their disappeared." This is Korea and the Philippines, the comfort women. This is a photograph of a woman named Kim Hak-sun. During World War II, the Japanese military forced women and girls throughout Asia into sexual slavery. Yet for half a century, the survivors bore their pain in silence. The brutalization they suffered was shrouded in secrecy. Then in 1991, Kim Hak-sun of South Korea broke silence with the declaration that at 16 years of age, she had been forced to serve as a comfort woman and was raped, she estimated, by 3,000 soldiers. Following Kim Hak-sun's lead, other Korean women came forward, then Lola Rosa in the Philippines, and then Jan O'Hearn in Indonesia. Hundreds of women from throughout Asia began to disregard their shame and speak publicly. They wanted justice. A litany of horrors of what happened was revealed to the world for the first time. It was estimated that as many as 200,000 women were subjected to rape, sexual slavery, and torture. This is the Philippines, a village called Mapanique. 178 women were raped. 68 were alive. I was there 3 years ago and interviewed 68 women who broke silence, and a number of them have died since. Lola Leoncia, she is passed on since she was 99 years old and the oldest living comfort woman in the Philippines. Lola Tarsia. They all are called Lola because that is a respectful term and means grandmother. This is the Red House, which is on the edge of the village, which is a garrison where the soldiers raped the women. This is Lola Maxima. Who is acting out her entire story. And she told us a story she had never told her daughters the story, and it was the first time that she broke silence to them. And these are both of her daughters, one on the edge listening, and Esther in the foreground listening to the story. And this is what she says. Lola Maxima: "Soldiers kidnapped me from the market. My grandmother tried to help me, and they tied our hands behind our backs and took us to the garrison. They tied my mouth with a handkerchief, and 2 soldiers raped me. We were held for a month, and then the soldiers left. I saw my grandmother being raped. I could not speak for more than a year. In 1991, I was watching TV and saw Lola Rosa calling for all women to come out and not be afraid. I had 8 children, and only my husband had known." Lola Cabrita: "One of the situations happening over and over again was that women were constantly taking off their clothes and wanting me to photograph, and it was initially, and in some ways continued to be, an enormous dilemma for me, because I obviously felt invasive, and it was wrong for me to do that. And I realized that really the women were giving evidence, and they wanted me to photograph their bodies to show the scars of what had happened to them. And in many cases, because this had happened 50 years ago, the scars were not necessarily visible, but to them they were obviously completely visible." This is Lola Julia and her 2 granddaughters. This is Lola Julia speaking. "I was 13 when the soldiers came and dragged me away. A lieutenant was caressing my back. I thought he thought I was his daughter, but then he was raping me. They held me in a tunnel for 8 months. I wore only an army towel. I was looking for a hand grenade that I could use. I would be able to kill a lot of Japanese soldiers. I wanted the rapes to stop, but I didn't want to die. If I died, I couldn't testify." Lola Hortensia: This is Korea. "The difference between the Philippines and Korea is that the women in Korea were actually taken out of Korea, and they were sent to China and Japan and Manchuria and Taiwan, and they were held for years and years and years, and many of them never made it home, and the ones that did really came home to no family left, or they were shunned by their families." And this is a house in Seoul that is for former comfort women. This is Gilwalk Oak and Hwan Kunju. Chang Dom-dol. It's a woman who told her story, and she was pregnant 3 times. The first time the baby died, the second time they aborted the baby, and the third time she gave birth and she never told her daughter what happened. Chai Gap Soon. Kim Soon-ok. Kim Soon-ok was, like many of the women, they were recruited. Many were abducted and many were recruited, and she was recruited, her family sent her away to Manchuria because they were told there was work in a silk factory. Kang Soon-ae, this is her speaking. "There had been an advertisement for the recruitment of female Korean nurses. Seeing the ads, my uncle said, 'Hide your daughter.' My mother said, 'But she's so young, she's only 12. I was caught and sent to Hiroshima. They began to train us on the ship. We drank rainwater. There was no medicine. They changed my name. When I was raped for the first time, I remember the sun was very hot. We all had stomach aches. There were a lot of soldiers. I was just too young." Kim Jong-ae. Kim Bok-dok, who's in Tongyang in the south of Korea, south of South Korea. Lee Do-soon in Tongyang. Park Ok-sun, and this is a residence house outside of Seoul where many of the former comfort women live. It's called the House of Sharing. When I arrived, the women had all come back from a portrait studio where a photographer had photographed them all in wedding dresses because they had never, ever been able to get married, and they were actually completely delighted with the photographs. The House of Sharing. This is in Seoul. Every single Wednesday since January 8th, 1992, women and their supporters have demonstrated outside the Japanese embassy. On December 8, 2000, in Tokyo, the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal began prosecution of charges against Japan for institutionalized military sexual slavery. The tribunal demanded that the Japanese government make a public apology to the women, pay compensation to individual women, raise awareness of the truth by amending educational curriculum to reflect historical realities, and identify and punish as far as possible the perpetrators. The tribunal began exerting pressure on international jurisprudence to recognize gender-based crimes and acknowledge them as war crimes against humanity. Lola Julia, whose picture you saw earlier from the Philippines, who was held in the tunnel, was one of the women who traveled to Japan who gave testimony at the first hearing in the Japanese court. She was asked, "How are we to believe that your story is true, that the Japanese held you and assaulted you for 8 months?" She replied, "I stood up in court and began to sing a song in Japanese. It was a song of the Japanese soldiers. They asked me, 'How did you learn that song?' Because," she said, "I heard them singing it every morning for 8 months. I will never forget." The Democratic Republic of Congo. As a documentary photographer for 30 years, I was certain that I had witnessed the worst atrocities and listened to the most terrifying stories of horror in the world. Then in May 2007, I went to an invisible war, where until recently there was almost no published information and mainly indifference. For the past 12 years in the Democratic Republic of Congo, more than 5 million people have died, making it the deadliest war since World War II. It is a war of exploitation and rape, of the earth and of women, the most precious resource on the planet. I arrived for the first time in May 2007 to the DRC with Eve Ensler, author of the Vagina Monologues. Our destination was Panzi Hospital in eastern Kivu. Every day at least 10 women arrive to Panzi. Some make their way on their own. Others are brought in ambulances on stretchers covered in blood, in agonizing pain. They have been assaulted by government soldiers, militias, and civilians who commit barbaric acts of sexual violence and operate under total impunity. The lucky women and girls make it to Panzi, where a remarkable surgeon, Dr. Dennis Mukwege, and a group of dedicated doctors and nurses attempt to treat these women. Many will need fistula repair surgery because they have been savagely raped and they are now leaking urine and feces. Dr. Mukwege will sew their bodies back together if he can. Age does not matter. There are girls as young as 3 and women as old as 80. Essentially, what is happening in the DRC is a femicide, a systematic annihilation of the female species through acts of sexual violence. These are initially all images of the women who are at Pansy Hospital who've either been treated and trying to go home if there is a home to go to, or are waiting for surgery. At one time, there were generally about 500 women and girls at Pansy Hospital. Dr. Mukwege. I'm not allowed to show the faces of girls under a certain age, and unfortunately there is an enormous population of young girls who have been assaulted who are at Pansy Hospital. And there are also a lot of little boys there who I fear for, because they have witnessed their mothers being raped, probably their fathers being killed, and then they come to Pansy Hospital and they really basically have nobody who's dealing with their trauma. These are women living in a house right next to Pansy Hospital for women who have been raped and given birth to their rapist babies. This is what it's like there. There's urine all over, feces and urine all over the hospital because women have no control over their bladders. This is a list of surgeries, 18 in one day at the hospital. Dr. Mukwege. Recovery room. Women returning to their village. Unfortunately, many of the women return again to Pansy Hospital. One of the difficulties for young girls who are raped is that their bodies aren't developed enough to have surgery. And these are 2 girls who are living at the hospital who probably won't be able to have the surgery, if they even can, for 8 years. This is Eve and Dr. Mukwege. We did a reading of the vagina monologues at the hospital with the nurses and psychologists, And I mean, you can't travel anywhere in the world without, with Eve Ensler, where you don't perform the vagina monologues and eventually act out the moans. One of the amazing things for me is that these are women whose bodies have been torn apart and whose spirits have not been. And there's always drumming or dancing down at the area I call the village, where the women kind of have tried to recreate their villages at Pansy Hospital. And I look at these pictures, or I'm with these women, and I think, wow, if they can get up and dance, man, we really, really can get up and dance, This little girl made this so I could photograph her and her face would remain hidden. This ended up in, I'm going to move into talking about the campaign that we have been working on there. This became, which you'll see later on in the show, the campaign poster to stop the violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is a second trip. We returned in November of 2007, and at this point, V-Day, which is an organization founded by Eve Ensler, and that's how I'm traveling to Democratic Republic of Congo, had formed an alliance with UNICEF, the United Nations Organization for Protection of Children. And we committed ourselves to stopping the violence and trying to come up with a campaign that the women in Congo asked us for. And what they told us they needed was a community where they could go and heal and come and become powerful, a transition place to turn pain into power. So we committed to building a community that is called the City of Joy, and we returned for the groundbreaking ceremony. And these are women coming out of the bush, arriving into Bukavu, and this is the town in Democratic of Congo where Pansy Hospital is. Bukavu is located on Lake Kivu, and the other end of Lake Kivu is Goma and Rwanda. And who is responsible for the attacks on these women? Well, some people will hold primarily accountable the soldiers from Rwanda who left after the genocide and escaped into the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'm referring to the genocide in 1994. And they are probably, Interahamwe is probably largely responsible, but really for the women, anybody in uniform has been a perpetrator. These women carry the burden of Africa on their backs. This is the beginning of the groundbreaking ceremony for the City of Joy. Just a note on activism here is that we took our first trip in May of 2007 and we broke ground on this community in November of 2007. So we were able to facilitate this happening in the middle of a genocide. And so again, anything is possible with the right intention and commitment between people. Really, there's nothing that you can't do. These are all images from the groundbreaking ceremony. And this is Elisa, who laid the first brick and will be living in the City of Joy. The next day, we launched the campaign, and thousands of women marched through the streets of Bukavu. And this, you can see now where the picture ended up becoming the campaign poster. Eve and Christine and Pernell, all people who are working for the campaign. The women's police force of Bukavu, there is one. Vagina Warrior. There was incredible, there were a lot, we brought these t-shirts and there were actually a lot of men who ended up wearing these, and this is Anisette, and he came and he met me at the airport in September when I arrived, and he just stood there wearing this t-shirt. Great men, there are great men in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The First Lady of Congo, Olive Kabila, came. So we had put enough pressure on the government for them to send, that she came, and a lot of representatives came also with her on a plane from Kinshasa. And she vowed, although we're sort of still waiting for that to happen, to stop violence against women. The heads of the military came to the launching. Eve giving a speech. It was. I always look at this picture and I think that, and think of the one of Olive Kabila and think it's like Che Guevara met Queen Elizabeth. And this is from the last trip, the last section of the work. We went back just in September of this year, and women broke silence. 15 women in Goma and Bukavu told their stories of sexual violations publicly for the first time, which was an incredibly brave act. I mean, I look at the comfort women who are breaking silence after 50 years, and I think, what an incredible brave act, to be determined to break silence towards the end of your life, to not take the secret to the grave. And these are women who are telling their stories while the genocide is occurring. This is Francine with her baby that was born of rape. She calls her baby Joyous. Marta, who was set on fire after she was raped. Valentina, who says, "My husband was forced with guns at his head to watch me being raped. The next day he accused me of liking it. He kicked me and our 5 children out of the house." This is Lumo, who was hospitalized for 3 years after she was raped, and her best friend, who she was raped with, died. Janet. Scarves that the women were given that say, "I survived." This is Francie and her baby. The women who testified who have no place to go home to live at a hospital. We arrived in Bukavu from Goma, and the hospital, Panzi Hospital, was attacked because there is no security whatsoever. And the hospital workers, the doctors and nurses and everybody immediately and courageously took to the streets and were attacked and beaten up by the police. And this is the beginning of preparing women who were testifying in Bukavu. Machete wound. We did every day we met with a woman before we began, we all together did trauma therapy. This is Marta. Jeanette. Claudine, this is the day before the women testified publicly. Jeanette, whose leg was blown off after they raped her. Honorata. The women with Eve prior to testifying. This is Honoré, who's quite a wonderful character and is the head of the sexual violence unit against women. In fact, she's the only person in the sexual violence unit in Bukavu, and actually all of the Kivu province. The women publicly testifying. Marta, who became pregnant and also HIV positive. Jeanette. Pascazine. Pascazine was a story, unfortunate and common, where she was raped, went to Pansy Hospital, was sent back to her village, and was raped again, and returned again to Pansy Hospital. Honorata, all the women at the end of their testimony would say, come, come and break the silence. We don't need to be, we don't want to be silent anymore. We want justice. The governor, we shamed the governor of Kivu into coming by squatting in his office for 6 hours. And this is Eve speaking, and I just want to say one comment that she said, which I thought was absolutely brilliant, and that is, she called on Bukavu and all the inhabitants of Bukavu to really make sure that they became the place in the world that said no to any violence against women ever again. Jeanette. And this is a closing image of Dr. Mukwege back at Pansy Hospital. I thank you all for your incredible hearts and generosity that enabled you to sit here and be with the women for this hour. I will be sure to tell each and every one of them that you were here and listened to their stories. Thank you. I welcome any questions, of course, that people will have. Whether you want to come up to the mic or not, it's fine.